We're on argument number 21, and this one is from Anselm.
Before getting into the various ontological arguments, I do want to say firstly to check out my ontological arguments playlist. Therein, I go through the modal ontological argument, I explain it in tremendous detail, I look at symmetry breakers, I look at the possibility premise, I look at Anselm's ontological argument, I look at Gödel's ontological argument, I look at Descartes' ontological argument, and so on. So definitely check out my ontological arguments playlist.
And in fact, rather than go through the sort of more faithful to the text version of Anselm's argument, and this is the classic ontological argument from Anselm in Proslogion 2. Let's just skip that one and go to the sort of...
So, I'm not going to skip it. I think premise 1 is false because God doesn't exist in my understanding. No, the idea of God exists in my understanding. So that's one problem. A second problem is that in order to avoid equivocation in this argument, the sense of God used throughout the argument needs to be uniform. Okay? So suppose it means the idea of God. Well, then the conclusion, of course, doesn't entail that God exists. It only means that the idea of God exists in reality. But now suppose that it means like God himself. That is, the being God. God himself. That omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect, creator of the universe, whatever. In that case, however, premise 1 is quite overtly question-begging. It is equivalent to saying that there exists an X such that X is God, and X is in the understanding, and X is not in reality. But of course, to say this is to simply say, in part, that God exists. You're saying there exists an X such that X is God. And so premise 1 assumes the very thing in need of demonstration. Now, of course, this is not actually fully faithful to Anselm's text. In order to get 8 validly following, you have to say God does, in fact, exist in the understanding, and then you go on to say, okay, suppose he only exists in the understanding, but not in reality. And then you go on to conclude, by reductio, that no, it's actually false that God exists only in the understanding, but not in reality. And since he does, in fact, exist in the understanding, he must also thereby exist in reality. So you need an additional premise here to the effect that God does, in fact, exist in the understanding. So that's really the additional premise that I was targeting when I said, firstly, that that's false, because God doesn't exist in my understanding. The idea of God exists in my understanding, so it has a false premise. But even setting that aside, we have to talk about equivocation. And in the argument, we either mean the idea of God or God himself. If we mean the idea of God, well then, that has to be consistent throughout, and in which case the conclusion doesn't actually get us God's existence. It gets us that the idea of God exists in reality. But of course, if we mean God himself, well then, the implicit zeroth premise, that God does in fact exist in the understanding, says that there exists an X such that X is God and X is in the understanding. But of course, no atheist would ever grant that there exists an X such that X is God. So they would never grant that premise. And Josh Rasmussen actually really nicely makes this point. So this is a review of a book. The book is A.D. Smith's Anselm's Ontological Argument. So this is Josh writing here. He says, Anselm of Canterbury thought that belief in God can be based upon reason itself. He sought to prove God's reality by reasoning about the concept of God. God, by definition, is the greatest thinkable being. No greater being is even conceivable. Now, a being is surely greater if it exists in reality than if it exists merely in one's imagination. So, a greatest thinkable being exists in reality, and therefore God exists in reality. This classical argument feels like clever trickery. Is it? Well, nearly every philosopher since Anselm has considered the argument fallacious. Strangely, however, isolating the precise place where the argument falters has proven rather tricky. Part of the difficulty is that Anselm offers more than one version of his argument, and objections to one version don't necessarily apply to all the others. But such multiplicity notwithstanding, many philosophers think that when we clearly express Anselm's argument in any of its forms using the language of contemporary logic, we find an ambiguity in the term God. Suppose the term God is understood as a name that actually picks out an existing entity. Then the argument is circular, because the first premise assumes that God exists. Alternatively, we may understand the term God as expressing the concept of God. Then the problem is that no mere concept qualifies as the greatest thinkable being, so the argument is unsound. In any case, just about everyone, theist and atheist alike, agrees there is something wrong with Anselm's classic argument. So anyway, that's a simple dilemma that kind of afflicts Anselm's ontological argument. This point about equivocation. We might try to avoid that by saying that we're just using one sense of God, but that we're talking about different ways or modes of being in which one single entity can exist, right? It can exist in a conceptual way, or it can exist in a real way. So it's one and the same entity, and it simply enjoys different modes or ways of being. Now, firstly, this is facially implausible. That just seems just deeply implausible, at least by my lights. and it's actually borderline unintelligible, this talk about modes and ways of being. But secondly, it assumes ontological pluralism, and yet we should reject ontological pluralism. Ontological pluralism is the thesis that there's more than one way of being or mode of existence. There are different kinds of existence. Some things really exist, but other things don't really exist, but only, like, conceptually exist. I don't know, it's really hard to make sense of, and it's really implausible, and I had Trent Merricks on my channel again to talk about why we should reject that view. And thirdly, as a third response to this, I'm going to say, if it's one and the same being in each case, well then God himself, albeit God himself existing in a conceptual mode of being, depends upon my mind. But then a mode of being of God is dependent, right? And yet God is identical to whatever God has, per divine simplicity. And Anselm, of course, accepted divine simplicity. And so God is identical to any mode of being that he has. And so God is identical to this conceptual mode of being, assuming again that the argument is talking about one and the same being just existing in different ways, which it has to if it's to avoid equivocation. But in that case, God is dependent, because that conceptual mode of being depends on my mind, and moreover, God is identical to this conceptual mode of being because he's identical to everything that he has. But of course, that's incompatible with traditional theism. God is not a dependent being. And moreover, God would then be something intrinsic to but distinct from me, and so God would be a part of me, and yet that's incompatible with classical theism. God isn't a part of anything in creation. Lots of apophaticists might even reject this number 3. They might say, no, God is so transcendent that we can't even conceive of him. So that's another mode of criticism. Here's a still further mode of criticism. Premise 2 here is false. Existence in reality is greater than existence in the understanding alone. I think that that is straightforwardly false. And let's look at Alexander Pruss explain why. So Alexander Pruss, he says, it makes no sense to talk of the greatness of a non-existent being except hypothetically, as the greatness it would have if it existed. When we compare the greatness of things, we compare what the things would be like if they existed. Thus, when we say that Thor is greater than Hermes, we mean something like this. If Thor existed, he would be greater than Hermes would be if Hermes existed. And to exist is to exist in reality. But now take the crucial claim in Anselm's argument that it is greater for X. But now take the crucial claim in Anselm's argument that it is greater for X to exist in mind and in reality. But now take the crucial claim in Anselm's argument that it is greater for X to exist in mind and in reality than just in mind. This claim is simply false when we understand it in the hypothetical way. For we need to compare the greatness of the X that exists in mind and reality to the greatness that the X that exists only in mind would have if it existed in reality. But that's the same greatness. So Anselm's original ontological argument has just a clearly false premise 2, at least by my lights. Moreover, a still further criticism of Anselm's ontological argument derives from the distinction between encoded and attributed properties. And to bring out this point, we are going to listen to what I say in my 3K AMA. So this isn't actually my 3K AMA, it's a clip from my 3K AMA, but it's actually my video 4 ontological arguments in 12 minutes. I've put it on 1.5 times speed, and this is the criticism from the distinction between encoded and attributed properties.
A third problem that I would say is one that Oppie's written on. He makes the distinction between encoded and attributed properties. He talks about this in his Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on ontological arguments. So Oppie writes, following Anselm, we might say that since you understand the expression smallest really existent Martian, there is in your understanding at least one smallest really existent Martian. However, in saying this, it must be understood that we are not actually predicating properties of anything. We aren't supposing that there is something which possesses the properties of being a Martian really existing and being no larger than any other Martian. In other words, we must be able to have the concept of, or entertain the idea of, a smallest really existing Martian without believing that there really are any smallest Martians. Indeed, more strongly, we must be able to entertain the concept of a smallest really existent Martian and to recognize that the property of really existing is part of this concept, while nonetheless maintaining that there are no smallest existent Martians. It'll be useful to introduce vocabulary to mark the point which is being made here. We could, for instance, distinguish between the properties which are encoded in an idea or concept and the properties which are attributed in positive atomic beliefs which have that idea or concept as an ingredient. The idea, really existent Santa Claus, encodes the property of real existence, but it is perfectly possible to entertain this idea without attributing real existence to Santa Claus, that is, without believing that Santa Claus really exists. We can then apply this distinction to Anselm's argument. On the one hand, the idea, being than which no greater can be conceived, encodes the property of real existence. This is what the reductio argument from Anselm establishes, if it establishes anything at all. On the other hand, it is perfectly possible to entertain the idea of a being than which no greater can be conceived, and to recognize that this idea encodes the property of real existence without attributing real existence to a being than which no greater can be conceived. That is, without believing that a being than which no greater can be conceived really exists. Okay, so those are my 3 main issues. I mean, there are more, but those are my 3. So you can see my video, Ontological Arguments with Tyron Goldschmidt, but those are my 3 main issues.
The first objection was that no, God doesn't exist in your understanding. The idea of God exists in your understanding, so the implicit premise here is false. Another objection was that in order to avoid equivocation, you have to precisify what you are meaning by God, and you either mean the idea of God or God himself. In the first case, the conclusion doesn't get you God's existence, but in the second case, the argument is blatantly question-begging, so that's the second response. The third response is that it seems to rely on ontological pluralism, but we should reject ontological pluralism. A fourth criticism is someone might who is inclined to apophatic theology might reject premise 3. They might say that God isn't, after all, conceivable. A fifth objection is that no, premise 2 is false. That was Pruss's point about hypothetical greatness, so that's a fifth response. A sixth response is this distinction between encoded and attributed properties that Oppie makes and applies to the argument. And now here's a seventh response. Everyone pronounces it differently, but what, Guanalo or Gonalo? Guanalo's greatest conceivable island parody. Now, I actually used to think this argument failed, but one of Graham Oppie's recent publications, published in 2017, actually seems to have convinced me that no, it doesn't actually fail. So suppose that the greatest conceivable island, which of course the fool who denies such a thing, denies the reality of such a thing, understands, of course, and of course whatever is understood exists in the understanding, so the greatest conceivable island exists in the understanding. Now suppose that the greatest conceivable island exists in the understanding but not in reality. Well, existence in reality is greater than existence in the understanding alone. And, moreover, having all the properties of this greatest conceivable island plus existence in reality can be conceived, right? I can certainly conceive of this island existing. So, a being having all of this island's properties plus existence in reality is greater than this greatest conceivable island. Because, again, we're assuming that the greatest conceivable island only exists in the understanding. And yet we can conceive of one that exists in the understanding and in reality. And yet that would be better. So an island greater than the greatest conceivable island can be conceived. But that, of course, is absurd. Then you'd be conceiving of something greater than literally the greatest conceivable island. That's just incoherent. And so it's false that the greatest conceivable island exists only in the understanding, but not also in reality. And since it does exist in the understanding, it must also thereby exist in reality. Bada bing, bada boom, we've proved a greatest conceivable island. So here is the 2017 article from Graham Oppie that I am talking about. I believe this is published with Palgrave Macmillan. I think it's in some sort of reference book that they publish. Yeah, Macmillan Interdisciplinary Handbooks. Anyway, he contributed a chapter to one of the handbooks. Anselm's argument, we can equally construct a parody. Here's the parody that he goes through. I'm not going to go through it because I basically just gave one. Now, Graham Oppie then points out how, I mean, it just seems obvious that there's a kind of epistemic parity with a T between them. There's a kind of symmetry between them. Now, Oppie also addresses the reason that I was hesitant to think that Gonalo's greatest conceivable island objection succeeds. So, it's sometimes said that Gonalo's objection fails because there is, and can be, no such thing as an island than which no greater island can be conceived. For example, Plantinga says, the idea of an island than which it is not possible that there be a greater is like the idea of a natural number than which it is not possible that there be a greater, or the idea of a line than which none more crooked is possible. There neither is nor could be a greatest possible number. Indeed, there isn't a greatest actual number. And the same goes for islands. No matter how great an island is, no matter how many Nubian maidens and dancing girls adorn it, there could always be greater, one with twice as many, for example. The qualities that make for greatness in islands, number of palm trees, amount and quality of coconuts, for example, have no intrinsic maximum. That is, there is no degree of productivity, or number of palm trees, or of dancing girls, such that it is impossible that an island display more of that quality. So the idea of a greatest possible island is an inconsistent or incoherent idea. It's not possible that there is such a being. It's this response that the great-making properties of an island don't have any intrinsic maxima. But there are a number of problems with this. Here are 6 replies. So first, surely, at least for Christians, they want to say that God's being Trinitarian is one of God's great-making features. What, you think that that makes God worse or doesn't even at all contribute to his value? No, that's one of the central aspects of Christianity. But then, the number of divine persons in which God exists likewise admits of no intrinsic maximum. Plantinga's response here would equally apply to the greatest conceivable being, at least with respect to Christianity. Because this great-making feature of God, namely the number of divine persons, that's a quantitative feature. It's the number of divine persons. And so, just like the amount of coconuts, or the number of coconuts, as he should have said, it's not an amount. An amount is a mass noun rather than a count noun. He should have said the number of coconuts. I myself make that mistake quite often. But anyway, set that aside. The number of coconuts, that's a quantitative attribute. It doesn't have any intrinsic maximum. You could always, in principle, have one more coconut, let's say. You could just add 1 to the number of coconuts. Maybe it's 100,000. You could have 100,001. But of course, the exact same is true of the number of divine persons. That's a quantitative attribute. God exists in exactly 3 persons, not 4, not 5, not 6, not 7. And so the number doesn't admit of any intrinsic maximum. Similar things can be said about the strengths of God's reasons and desires. So, God desires some things more than he desires others. For instance, he desires that at least some people be saved more than that he desires that no people be saved. he desires to bring about great goods more than he desires not to bring about great goods, and so on. If you deny this, if you say that all of God's desires are like literally infinitely intense, then you completely gut theism of its explanatory power. Then you're not going to be able to generate any predictions whatsoever, because literally anything that God could potentially desire, he desires to an unlimited degree, and so we are left completely in the dark as to what he would in fact do, because his preference structure wouldn't then generate any predictions about which among the infinitely many things that he could desire, like the infinitely many goods that could possibly obtain. We have no guidance here whatsoever. Moreover, a perfectly rational being would have a preference or desire structure which tracks objective values and the relative weights of them. So some worlds are going to be objectively more valuable than others. So some possible worlds are such that they have lots of people living very happy and flourishing lives, whereas some other worlds are going to have only a couple people living very, very mild lives. The former world is much more valuable than the latter world, and so a perfectly moral and perfectly rational being should have a preference structure or desire structure which is such that the perfect being desires the world that's better than the other world. It desires it more than the other one. It would be absurd to say that God desires these two equally. That would just be absurd. And so, God's desires and the very strengths of reasons for which he acts, those also, in some sense, emit of degrees. And these are, moreover, great-making features of God. It is a great-making feature of God that he has a perfectly rational, perfectly good preference structure that accurately maps and tracks the objective values of things and how they compare with one another. And so the exact same thing that Plantinga is pointing out here with respect to islands is also true of God. Various great-making features of God are also such that they are degreed or quantitative, and they don't admit of an intrinsic maximum. God doesn't hit that intrinsic maximum because sometimes, to be perfectly rational, you have to desire some things more than others, or the degree to which you have reason to do one thing is stronger than the degree to which you have reason to do another thing. So that's the first response. It's just that the exact same point that Plantinga is making with respect to islands also applies to at least the Christian God, and I've argued the theistic God more generally with respect to strengths of reasons and desires. Second, Plantinga here is seeming to suggest that the coherence of an idea requires the possibility of its referent, right? He's saying, no, there neither is nor could be a greatest possible number. And he's trying to conclude from this that, no, the idea is either inconsistent or incoherent or whatever. But if a condition on being a coherent idea is the possibility of its referent, or if the coherence of an idea requires the possibility of its referent, then the coherence of the idea of the greatest conceivable being similarly requires the possibility of a greatest conceivable being. But we already know by the modal ontological argument that the possibility of a greatest conceivable being implies its actuality. And so Anselm's argument, per Plantinga's reply here, would require the coherence of the idea of the greatest conceivable being, which in turn would require the possibility of such a being, which in turn, given the standard system of modal logic S5, would require its actuality. But of course, in that case, affirming the coherence of the idea is simply to beg the very question at issue. It is to simply assume the existence of the greatest conceivable being in an argument attempting to demonstrate that very thing. A third response is another reason for thinking that it's unclear how God's various great-making attributes could hit intrinsic maxima. So, for instance, the intrinsic maximum of justice and mercy, it's difficult to see how God could hit their intrinsic maxima. You would think that a maximally just judge would not be lenient in any sense. It would divvy up punishments and rewards to people exactly in proportion to their merit or what they deserve. But of course, that's precisely what mercy doesn't do. Mercy gives, in some sense, less punishment than deserved, or perhaps more reward than deserved. So, a maximally merciful judge, it would seem, would not be a maximally just judge. And so it doesn't seem to be the case that God could hit the intrinsic maxima of justice and mercy. There would seem to have to be some kind of trade-off between the two. At the very least, this is a potentially problematic aspect of Plantinga's response on behalf of Anselm's argument in response to the Guanalo parody. Anyway, that's the third point. The fourth point in response to Plantinga is that it's unclear whether admitting of higher quantities or degrees of great-making features would automatically make the island better. Perhaps there's an ideal, unique concoction of quantities and degrees of great-making features. Maybe there is actually a precise number of coconuts and a precise size of the island and so on, which is the ideal, unique concoction of quantities and degrees which render it the best possible, indeed the best conceivable island. Nothing Plantinga says rules this out, and yet he would need to rule it out in order for his defense of the argument to succeed. Fifth, we can just modify the island example in the following way. Instead of focusing on the greatest conceivable island, we can focus on the island that is the greatest conceivable simply with respect to its existential status, that is, the way in which it exists and whether it exists. This completely avoids the intrinsic maximum point, because we're not talking about the greatest conceivable island as such, we're talking about that island which is simply the greatest conceivable with respect to its existential status, and you're going to be able to conclude that the island in question exists, but you're also going to be able to prove the existence of basically anything. You could talk about that unicorn, which is the greatest conceivable simply with respect to its existential status. And so if the unicorn, which is the greatest conceivable with respect to its existential status, didn't exist, well, then we could conceive of one that is better with respect to its existential status, which is absurd. This is the greatest conceivable unicorn with respect to its existential status. And so we can prove the existence of basically anything, so it seems. That's the fifth response. The sixth response is that the example of an island is entirely tangential. We can pick out something which actually does seem to have intrinsic maxima for its great-making features. So consider a solo omniscient being. A solo omniscient being is a necessary being who, by nature, has exactly one ability: to know the truth values of propositions. Given this, the idea of the greatest conceivable solo omniscient being is perfectly coherent. Unlike an island, which has various great-making capacities that admit of higher quantities and degrees, a solo omniscient being has only one great-making capacity, and that capacity has an intrinsic maximum, namely omniscience, that is, knowing the truth value of every proposition. And we can then run the argument with a solo omniscient being. We can run a parity argument with a solo omniscient being. It exists in the understanding, because you understand it, and whatever is understood exists in the understanding. And moreover, it would be a better solo omniscient being if it existed in reality than if it just existed in the mind. And so if it didn't also exist in reality, we could conceive of a greater solo omniscient being than the greatest conceivable solo omniscient being, which, of course, is absurd, and hence such a thing actually exists in reality. But that, of course, that's an absurd parody, just like the greatest conceivable island parody. For starters, it implies that God isn't the only necessary omniscient being, which is incompatible with traditional theism, and moreover, we can also now prove infinitely many such beings. We can just consider a solo omniscient -1 being, which is a being just like a solo omniscient being, that is simply by nature unable to know one specific truth. This being, too, has great-making features not admitting of an intrinsic maximum. It's impossible for such a being to know that specific truth that it doesn't have, and so it's no mark against its greatness as a solo omniscient -1 being that it doesn't know it. So again, we still have absurd parodies in the neighborhood, even if we grant Plantinga's point about, okay, fine, maybe islands have great-making features which admit of greater quantity or greater degree, and that this somehow debars there from being a coherent idea of the greatest conceivable island. Even if we granted him that, which I've argued that we shouldn't, we can still run parody arguments that generate absurdities. So here's what Oppie says in response to Plantinga. Note, however, that it is supposed to be uncontroversial that the words "that than which no greater can be conceived" are understood. If we are going to enter into controversial philosophical arguments about whether words are, in some technical sense, coherent, for example, whether they refer to something that could possibly exist, then it is controversial whether the words "that than which no greater can be conceived" are understood. There are plenty of controversial philosophical arguments for the conclusion that the words "that than which no greater can be conceived" are incoherent in relevant technical senses. It is, for example, highly controversial whether the words "that than which no greater can be conceived" refer to something that could possibly exist. And I add here that no atheist would ever grant that it's even possible, given what we know from the modal ontological argument debate. It's also worth noting that it is controversial whether considerations about an intrinsic maximum suggest that there is a more serious worry about the coherence of the words "that island than which no greater can be conceived" than there is about the coherence of the words "that being than which no greater can be conceived. On the one hand, greatness for islands involves trading off a whole lot of considerations, including size, ecodiversity, population, and so forth. An island than which no greater can be conceived will not be too large, nor too crowded with palm trees, nor too crowded with people. That there is no intrinsic maximum to size, or number of palm trees, or population, provides no reason to suppose that we cannot coherently speculate about islands than which no greater islands can be conceived. On the other hand, if that than which no greater can be conceived is to hit intrinsic maxima for every attribute that it has, then those intrinsic maxima must be possibly jointly co-instantiated. But, for example, there is a serious question as to whether something can be both maximally merciful and maximally just. Moreover, there are attributes that do not hit intrinsic maxima, that at least some philosophers want to ascribe to that than which no greater can be conceived. For example, that it consists of 3 persons, and I add that it has certain weights or degrees of desires and strengths of reasons. It is perhaps also worth observing that in an everyday sense, we do understand the words "the greatest possible number." We must first understand the words in order to be able to see that there can be no such thing. And in fact, I want to note here that this actually plausibly provides a counterexample to Anselm's claim that whatever is understood exists in the understanding. I understand the greatest possible number. Does it follow that there actually exists a greatest possible number in my understanding? Okay, if it does, what number is it? Tell me. Tell me. Anselm's argument fails quite drastically, and so In addition to the plethora of objections that I've already leveled to Anselm's argument, I think I leveled 6 or 7. I don't think the response from there being no intrinsic maxima from Plantinga, I don't think that that succeeds. And I also just gave it like a 7th or an 8th response to Anselm's argument by means of a counterexample, which is that we have to understand the greatest possible number. We have to understand that phrase in order to be able to see that there can be no such thing. But, of course, given Anselm's argument, whatever's understood exists in the understanding, so it would follow that there, like, literally exists the greatest possible number in my understanding. And that just seems absurd. No, there's no such number in my understanding. There cannot be such a number in any sense whatsoever, whether in my understanding or in reality. Just, no. Anyway, let us continue.
Simplified version. Next.
A being, than which no greater can be conceived, exists at least in the mind. Premise 2, it is greater to exist in reality than to exist only in the mind. 3, so a being which no greater can be conceived exists not only in the mind, but also in reality. And then the conclusion, so God exists.
Now, basically everything that I said with respect to the previous version applies here. You still have the point about existing in the mind versus existing in reality. So you have still the point about ontological pluralism. You have the point that no, the greatest conceivable being doesn't actually exist in my mind. The idea exists in my mind. You have the point about encoded versus attributed properties. You have the point about no, premise 2 being false with Pruss's criticism. You have parodies concerning the greatest conceivable islands and solo omniscient beings, and so on and so on and so on. So this faces the same problems.
There you go, classic Anselmian ontological argument.
Yeah, this is actually the argument, the version of the ontological argument that most atheists on YouTube actually target, which is interesting. We're going to see because there's so many different versions. They kind of attack the oldest and the easiest to respond to.
Okay. Which is something that's interesting because you guys are including this in a list of 150, even though it's pretty much almost universally agreed that it just utterly fails. And, of course, they go at the end and they plug in, like, oh, 150. It's like, oh, like, no. Like, you guys are including arguments that are almost universally agreed to fail. I mean, I know that they said take seriously. Like, they said at the beginning that philosophers take these seriously. I guess that's in a sense, like, yes, philosophers take this argument seriously in the sense that they grapple with it. They try to find where precisely it goes wrong. But most philosophers don't take it seriously in the sense of thinking that it does or even could succeed. So, yeah, you could complain about internet atheists really just objecting to Anselm's ontological argument, but don't then turn around and use this as a kind of apologetic. And I know they said at the beginning that they're not, per se, advancing these arguments as an apologetic. And they also don't say at the beginning that they accept all of them, of course. But near the end, of course, they're like, but I do want to play around with the numbers. And then they start, like, showing how, oh, it's incredibly difficult to reject God's existence given all this stuff. Like, come on.
Okay, so jumping forward from Anselm to Descartes, there's a famous quote by Descartes, which is that I clearly see that existence can no more be separated from the essence of God than can its having 3 angles equal to 2 right angles be separated from the essence of a triangle, or the idea of a mountain from the idea of a valley. So there is no less absurdity in thinking of a God, a supremely perfect being, who lacks existence, than in thinking of a mountain without a valley. And so he gives this argument.
No, this is again the distinction between encoded and attributed. We can recognize that encoded within the idea or concept of God is existence, and indeed necessary existence. Yeah, sure, that's part of the definition of God, but that doesn't at all commit you to saying that in a positive atomic belief, attributing existence or even necessary existence to God. I could, again, give the example of the smallest really existent Martian. By definition, this Martian exists, right? It's the smallest really existent Martian. So, it's part of its very definition to exist. But that just means existence is encoded in this idea or this concept or this description. It doesn't mean that we have to attribute existence in a positive atomic belief or a positive atomic claim to the smallest really existent Martian. And of course, there are no Martians, so there is no smallest really existent Martian, despite the fact that I can clearly see that existence can no more be separated from the essence of what it is to be a smallest really existent Martian. Again, scholars don't really take Descartes' ontological argument seriously apart from trying to find the interesting ways in which it fails and how that relates to essences and existence and so on.
Premise 1. If I cannot conceive of X without Y, then Y belongs to the nature of X. 2. I cannot conceive of a supremely perfect being without existence. So, existence belongs to the nature of a supremely perfect being. 4, if existence belongs to the nature of a supremely perfect being, then a supremely perfect being exists. 5, a supremely perfect being exists.
So, premise 4 is false. Here's one way to see it. If I cannot conceive of X without Y, then Y belongs to the nature of X. I cannot conceive of a smallest really existent Martian without existence. If you're conceiving of a smallest really existent Martian, then if you haven't conceived of it as existing, then you failed to conceive of it because I specified in that idea that it's a smallest really existent Martian. Therefore, existence belongs to the nature of a smallest really existent Martian. What it is to be a smallest really existent Martian is to really exist. That's part of its definition. It's part of its content as an idea or a concept or definition. Premise 4, if existence belongs to the nature of a smallest really existent Martian, then a smallest really existent Martian exists. Whoa, a smallest really existent Martian exists. Whoa, we just proven the existence of Martians. No.
More or less included because of its historical importance. And I should note that Spinoza and Leibniz also had their own spins on the ontological argument, but their versions look pretty similar to Descartes' just outlined.
And as a general point, there's no strict logical entailment from the former to the latter. You're not able to go simply from the fact that some property P belongs to X's nature, that it is true that there exists an X such that X is P. All you're saying when you're saying that P belongs to X's nature is that necessarily if X exists, then X is P. So all you're saying there is that, hey, if there is such a thing as X, then it has to be P, right? It's a condition on being that thing that it is P. But that doesn't, of course, commit you to there actually being an X that is P.
So let's go ahead and move on.
Okay.
So I'm actually going to be a little bit short with this one because premise 1 has quite an obvious objection. Well, 2 quite obvious objections. Firstly, you have the symmetry problem for this one. You can also say it's possible that the greatest conceivable being doesn't exist. And, of course, then you can run through pretty much the exact same argument and get that, no, it doesn't exist. And what Malcolm is allegedly showing here is that we are going essentially from the possibility of this thing to its necessary existence. But then, of course, you could just say, well, no, it's possible that it doesn't exist, and then you're actually going to be able to conclude its impossibility. So you can equally well run an argument saying it's possible that the greatest conceivable being doesn't exist. And then you can conclude that there is no such being, and indeed there cannot be such a being. And so what that means is that why the heck should we accept premise 1 as opposed to that symmetrical premise that it's possible that no greatest conceivable being exists? You can't appeal to conceivability of these other sorts of things, like, oh, well, I can at least conceive of there being a world in which the greatest conceivable being exists, because I can also conceive of a world in which it is true that there is no such greatest conceivable being. So anyway, there's a symmetry problem for this first premise. You can run a reverse argument with an incompatible conclusion that has a possibility premise that is equally as modest as this premise, and that is at least as intrinsically probable as this premise. And I would argue that it's actually more intrinsically probable. And the second problem, again, is just like, listen, no one who isn't antecedently inclined to theism would be willing to grant this first premise without being given some other independent argument in favor of it. Because to grant that it's possible that a greatest conceivable being exists, we know that that just is to grant that the greatest conceivable being actually exists. So no atheist would ever grant this first premise, and indeed you would antecedently have to reject atheism in order to even be in a position to accept this first premise. As Avi points out, if you accept the principles of modal logic that support the inferential moves in the argument, and you agree that there's an unsurpassably great being or that there's a greatest conceivable being, then you'll of course think that the argument is sound. But contrariwise, if you accept the principles of modal logic that support the inferential moves in the argument, and you agree with those who deny that there's an unsurpassably great being, or with those who deny that there's a greatest conceivable being, then you will think that the argument is unsound. Once we have both of these arguments before us, that it's possible that such a being exists and it's possible that it doesn't exist, it's obvious that neither of them provides anyone with any reason to change their views about whether there is an unsurpassably great being. It just doesn't give anyone any additional reason to think that God exists. Whether or not you think the argument is sound is just going to entirely be a function of your pre-existent commitments, whether or not you are a theist or an atheist, and so it's just dialectically toothless. The same is going to be going pretty much for every single modal ontological argument, unless, of course, you're providing an independent reason, a symmetry breaker, an independent argument that favors one possibility premise over the other. So anyway, because of the implausibility of at least lots of these modal arguments, we are going to be skipping them in the sense of just going through. Yeah, here, let's look at this one, because this one is actually interesting. So anyway, here is Anselm's, or at least a construction of Anselm's Proslogion 3 argument. I know some people say Proslogion.
Formulation where Plantinga and others sort of distill Anselm's other argument down into this. Either God's existence is logically impossible, or it is logically necessary. If God's existence is logically impossible, the concept of God is contradictory. The concept of God is not contradictory, so God's existence is logically necessary.
Yeah, so I think premise 1 is false by my lights. Logical impossibility is a matter of a sentence either being of the form P and not P, or else logically entailing by dint of its formal structure a sentence of the form P and not P. Given this, I simply reject that either God's existence logically entails a statement of the form P and not P, or God's non-existence logically entails a statement of the form P and not P. So I don't think either of those is strictly logically inconsistent. I think this is a question of metaphysical possibility and metaphysical necessity, not logical impossibility and logical necessity. Logical impossibility and logical necessity are matters of the form of sentences, whether or not they are either of the form P and not P, or else entail, by dint of their logical structure, by dint of their abstract form, some statement of the form P and not P. But I think God's existence is a metaphysical matter. It's a question that isn't going to be settled by purely logical grounds. You're going to have to go to different metaphysical principles and so on, and you're going to have to ask, is God's existence metaphysically possible? And I think, yes, God's existence is either metaphysically impossible or metaphysically necessary. That is, either God exists in all possible worlds or he exists in none, and where a possible world is just a total or complete way that reality could be. But I reject premise one, and I think it's really implausible that a strict logical contradiction is going to be entailed either from God's existence or God's non-existence, provided that you can give a consistent specification of what you mean by God. Premise 3 here is actually somewhat difficult to justify, so it really does depend on your concept of God, but we should at least be wary that it is somewhat difficult to justify, since there's always the looming epistemic possibility that there's a contradiction that you simply haven't yet discovered. We have to keep in mind the distinction between not seeing a contradiction within a concept, or being able to tease out a contradiction from a concept, and actually positively seeing that there is no contradiction. That's a crucial distinction. There's a distinction between not seeing a contradiction, or not being aware of some contradiction, and actually seeing that there is no contradiction, and being aware of the fact that there is no contradiction. And it's difficult to disentangle those. So even if you don't see a contradiction in a concept, it doesn't follow that it doesn't actually have a contradiction. It doesn't even follow that you see that there is no such contradiction. And of course, I think that this argument is susceptible of parody. We could just talk about atheism. No, I'm not even talking about naturalism, or not even materialism. We could be thinking of some sort of mystical, non-theistic Neoplatonism. But my point is just that let's just talk about atheism, just the strict denial that there is such a thing as a God. Let's say an omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect creator of the universe, or whatever. So I can then say atheism is either logically necessary or logically impossible. But atheism is logically impossible only if it entails a contradiction. But atheism doesn't entail a contradiction, so we can conclude that atheism is logically necessary.
And you see here, this ontological argument is starting to push into more contemporary terrain, which we'll get into. Formulation of Anselm's other argument. And it's...
All right, so look at premise 7 here. This is why I'm going to skip this one. It says it's not the case that necessarily a perfect being does not exist. This is literally saying it's possible that a perfect being exists. And of course, I've already went through why this is just the dreaded possibility premise. This is going to face a symmetry problem, and moreover, no non-theist would ever grant this without being given some further independent reason. Maydole's, look, it's possible that a perfect being exists. Okay, it's possible that a perfect being doesn't exist. So this suffers from the same problem. So let's continue. Anselm's other argument.
Where he discovers a third argument in Anselm. And it goes like this. This is the next slide here. If anything that cannot be conceived to be caused can be conceived to exist, it actually exists. God can be conceived to exist, but cannot be conceived to be caused. Therefore, God actually exists.
So the person who wrote the book may have anticipated what I'm about to say, but at least prima facie, I reject premise 1. Consider the following. This is a concept that I'm going to give you. An uncaused unicorn, okay? That's the concept. It's a unicorn that is essentially uncaused. Now, I can't conceive this thing to be caused, because then it would be a caused, uncaused unicorn. That just, no, that doesn't make any sense. So I can't conceive this thing to be caused. I don't know what it would be for an uncaused unicorn to be caused. That's contradictory. So I can't conceive of an uncaused unicorn to be caused, and yet I can conceive of an uncaused unicorn to exist. It's not that difficult. I can conceive of unicorns to exist, and I can conceive of there being absolutely nothing within a given reality that could cause it to exist. So I can conceive of an uncaused unicorn. Does it follow that an uncaused unicorn actually exists? No, it doesn't. Alright, so I reject premise 1, at least prima facie. Also, it's not 100% clear to me that I cannot conceive God to have a cause. Again, it might depend on your conception of God, but hey, if God is Trinitarian, well then, it seems as though I can conceive of a Unitarian being, or something like the Neoplatonic one, that causally sustains the three divine persons together into a unified single Godhead. I don't know, there doesn't seem to be anything incoherent about that. Now, of course, you might, pack into your definition of God, okay, God is uncaused. Okay, fine. That would be a way to get around it. But then, of course, I probably fall back on my point about, yeah, I could still just equally bake into a definition of a unicorn that it's an uncaused unicorn, and then we have a counterexample to premise 1. Also, arguably, this seems to prove too much. It would seem to be able to deliver us polytheism, for instance. So I could run the argument with the theistic Hindu god, with the Unitarian Christian god, with the Muslim god, with the Trinitarian god, with a Binitarian god, with a Tetratarian god, with non-classical theistic god, with the classical theistic god, and so on. Because all these things are different descriptions of God, they will be ase, they can't be conceived to be caused, they're perfect beings aren't causally dependent on another, so I can't conceive them to be caused, and yet I can conceive all these things to exist. It's not as though, like, Hinduism is inconceivable, or Unitarian Christian theism is inconceivable, or Islam, the truth of Islam is inconceivable, or the truth of Judaism is inconceivable, or a Binitarian God is inconceivable. No, not at all. So I can conceive these things to exist, and moreover, they cannot be conceived to be caused. Does it follow that the Hindu God exists, that the Unitarian Christian God exists, that the Muslim God exists, that the Trinitarian God exists, that the Binitarian God exists, and all this infinities of gods, the non-classical theistic God, the classical theistic? No, that doesn't at all follow. So, again, this argument would be able to prove too much. Firstly, this seems to be a counterexample to that first premise, but even if we didn't grant that it's a counterexample, we would then seem to be able to prove the existence of this whole concoction of gods. And note, by these various gods, I mean the being satisfying exactly that description. So I'm not just talking about, like, the reference here. Maybe there's some sense in which, let's say, the Judaic God and the Christian God, even though they characterize God differently, their expressions are still picking out, referring to the one being that exists in reality, assuming God exists, of course. But that's not what I'm talking about when I say the Islamic God, the Judaic God, the Trinitarian God, the theistic Hindu God. I'm actually talking about a being satisfying exactly that description. And moreover, I can conceive of a being satisfying exactly that description. I cannot conceive each such being to be caused, and I can conceive them to exist, and so it would follow that each such being satisfying exactly those descriptions actually exists. And, of course, you'd be able to prove an actual infinity of gods and so on. So, anyway, I think that this is a very implausible argument.
Now we can skip. If you're interested in this argument, look at A.D. Smith's book, Anselm.
Okay, so there could possibly be something divine. I think you know what I'm going to say in response to this. Yes, it faces a symmetry problem, and of course, no one who is antecedently inclined to theism would grant that there's possibly something divine.
Let's just define some crucial terms here. Maximal excellence is a being has maximal excellence if it's omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good. A being has maximal greatness if it has maximal excellence in all possible worlds. Okay.
All right, with that out of the way, or with those definitions out there is a possible world in which a maximally great being exists.
You know what I'm going to say in response to that. Firstly, no one who isn't already a theist would grant that premise. Secondly, you have the symmetry problem. There's a possible world in which no maximally great being exists, which in turn gets you that a maximally great being is actually impossible. And actually, with this reverse premise, you might actually try to give symmetry breakers for that first premise, but there are also reverse symmetry breakers. You could say, hey, if something's good, then it's at least possible. Then you could say mental privacy is good. Thoughts being private to ourselves, that's good. So then you could say it's possible that we have private thoughts, but of course, if God exists, then our thoughts aren't private, right? There's an omniscient being that is privy to them. And so then possibly God doesn't exist, and then you'd be able to conclude that God doesn't exist. You could also take the possibility of gratuitous evils. I can conceive of a world in which there's pretty much nothing but horrendous suffering for like tons upon tons upon tons of conscious beings for their entire lives. But of course, in that world, God couldn't exist because no divine being would allow such a world where there's only such horrific evils and no goods accruing therefrom. And so, given that I can conceive of this world, you know, there doesn't seem to be a contradiction and so on, I'd be able to conclude that it's a possible world, and of course that means possibly God doesn't exist, and of course hence God doesn't exist. I'm not actually claiming to endorse these sorts of justifications for the reverse possibility premise, but my point is just that even though there are certain proffered justifications on behalf of the possibility premise in the modal ontological argument, which we are going to get to later in this video, there are also proffered justifications for the reverse modal ontological argument premise, that possibly God doesn't exist. So you need to be aware of those.
2, if there is a possible world in which a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds, including the actual world, and then the conclusion, so a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds, including the actual world.
The key insight that Plantinga is known for when it comes to the ontological argument, you know, the objection to ontological arguments, the biggest objection is that, oh, existence is not a perfection. You can't infer that God exists from the idea that existence is greater. Well, Plantinga's key insight is that, well, fine, existence might not be a perfection, but necessary existence is. So that's his key insight. And granted that, you can distill logical arguments into a very, very simple argument that has basically just one premise, and it's that God possibly exists. Because if God exists, it's pretty much universally agreed that God exists necessarily. But it follows immediately in two modal systems, modal system S5 and B, that if something is possibly necessary, it is necessary. So if God possibly exists, God exists. So we have the simplified, broken down, as simple as you can get, possibly God exists, so God exists. And the contemporary discussion on ontological arguments takes this basically for granted. It says, yes, this is what it boils down to. Does God possibly exist?
Well, some of the contemporary discussions on it, there is actually quite substantive debate in the metaphysics of modality as to whether or not S5 accurately captures metaphysical modality. People shouldn't take that for granted. There are lots of objections, like Nathan Salmon, for instance, has an objection to S5 and so on, and various other authors do as well. So we should at least keep that in mind, that the modal systems that undergird the inference from possibly necessary to necessary, it is possibly necessary that P, therefore it is necessarily the case that P, those aren't altogether uncontroversial. We should at least keep that in mind.
And we have arguments for and against that key possibility premise, possibly God exists. But as a good faith gesture, if you're not convinced that it follows that God exists from it's even being possible that God exists, here are two ways to derive that. In the next slide. So the first way is in S5, and the second way is in the weaker system, B. And so there are two ways you can do this. One is by offering what I'm going to call a defense, and the other is by offering what I'll call a demonstration. You actually try to prove that it's possible that God exists, rather than just argue, give an argument for why it's possible God exists. Arguments for the possibility premise, which we'll look at. We have Pruss's motivational center of our lives defense. We have Benjamin Arber's cumulative credence raiser argument. We have the axiarchic defense.
I'm not going to say anything on these now because each of these are going to be showing up at various points within the rest of the video. So,
defense, ontomystical defense. We'll look at all those, and then we have lastly a phenomenal defense, which I couldn't resist putting in there because it's my own defense, which just got accepted for publication. So
Nice.
if I could run through that really quickly. So the phenomenal defense depends on a view in philosophy just known as phenomenal conservatism, which is that if it appears to you that P, then you're prima facie justified in believing P. Now, this applies, I argue that this applies to appearances of possibility too, but with a qualification. So if something appears possible to you, that just means that you don't see anything contradictory or unclear about it. But if something appears impossible to you, then presumably you do see something contradictory or unclear about it. So here's an example. Suppose there's a barber who shaves all and only those men in town who do not shave themselves. You might think, oh, that seems possible, that appears possible. But when you think about it a little bit harder, you start running into troubles. If the barber who's a man in town does not shave himself, well, that means he must shave himself, which is a contradiction. Okay, so hence I propose the following modal principle. I am prima facie justified at face value, in believing P is possible based on its appearing possible to me, if and only if it's reasonable to believe that if P were impossible, it would probably appear impossible upon further reflection, just like in the barber example. So I apply this to the ontological argument and say, look, it appears possible that God exists. It's reasonable for me to believe that if it were impossible that God exists, it would probably appear to me that it's impossible that God exists upon further reflection, but it doesn't. When I further reflect on God's existence, nothing seems impossible or unclear about that, contradictory about that, so I'm justified in believing God possibly exists.
So there is a lot to say here. This is, again, in one of Chad's papers, and I actually looked at the paper a long while back, so I forget the specific details and the objections that he considers. So I'm just going to be giving my thoughts here, and I don't claim that Chad is unaware of these sorts of responses or whatever, but these are my comments from my current epistemic vantage point. So first, premise one is at least potentially quite problematic. I mean, for starters, do we really have seemings or appearances of these grand metaphysical claims extremely remote from our ordinary experience that are like highly ramified and highly theory-laden? It's not clear that we do. When I pick out like certain particular claims, hey, torture is bad or something like that, well, yeah, that appears to me to be true, and indeed, arguably that appears to be necessarily true. But if you're getting into like really highfalutin, highly theoretical claims like torture is necessarily bad in virtue of this particular consequentialistic moral theory developed by this one particular person in this paper or whatever, I start to think, no, I don't really have a seeming or an appearance of that. I mean, yes, I have a seeming or appearance of the necessary badness of torture or something like that. But when you start to get really highly ramified or highly theory-laden, these like super specific theory-laden descriptions of the phenomenon in question, ones that are very remote from ordinary experience and so on, it's really hard for me to see how we actually have positive appearings and seemings with respect to the truth of such highly ramified theory-laden claims. How would you distinguish having this, let's say, appearance or this seeming from simply not having the appearance of God's impossibility? There's a distinction between it appearing to be the case that God possibly exists versus simply not having the appearance of God's impossibility. For me, phenomenologically speaking, I don't know how to differentiate those. Let's talk about a concrete example. Before we discovered that water is H2O, and someone was considering the claim that water is H3O, they might have said, oh yeah, it appears to me that water is possibly H3O. Is that actually a positive appearance to them, or are they simply lacking the appearance that water's being H3O is impossible? They simply don't have the appearance or don't have the seeming of it's being impossible that water is H3O. They don't have some positive seeming. They've got this like giga Chad brain that they're like zooming into some like modal space fact or something like that. Like, no, they don't have the positive seeming that water is possibly H3O. They simply lack the seeming that water is not possibly H3O. So anyway, that's really, at least by my lights, what seems to be happening with respect to this case of the first premise. It's another problem with this argument. A lot of people don't even have that appearance. I don't really have that appearance. It doesn't appear to me that God possibly exists. It might not appear to me that God is impossible, but again, that's completely separate, as I've been explaining. And moreover, I mean, how do you distinguish this modal appearance from its simply appearing to you to be the case that something very much like God, but crucially distinct from him, perhaps even in a way that you can't even grasp, exists? How do you distinguish these sorts of appearances? So anyway, lots of these questions make me extremely hesitant to accept premise one, and I think it's potentially quite problematic for that reason. Moreover, with respect to this premise one, what do we mean by God? What precisely is this appearance? What's its content? If you're saying by God here, we mean an omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect, necessary thing, which you would need to say because this is in the context of the modal ontological argument, so you need to have the possibly necessary. Does it really appear to you that it's possibly the case that such an omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect, necessarily existent thing exists? I mean, it starts to become super unclear whether this thing is possible once you flesh out its various attributes. Once you say, like, okay, by God I mean something that's omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect, and so on. And of course, then you're asking, hold on a second, what's omnipotence? And then, of course, you get into the weeds of trying to analyze omnipotence, like, oh, he can do anything. Well, can he make a square circle? Okay, no, he can do anything metaphysically possible. Well, it's metaphysically possible to sin. Okay, he can do anything metaphysically possible consistent with his nature. But then consider McEar, which has only one causal power, like scratching its ear. That thing can do anything metaphysically possible consistent with its nature, but yet it's not omnipotent. So, like, you start to get into all these different weeds. Once you start fleshing out what we mean by God, it becomes extremely unclear whether such a thing is possible. Like, I just start to throw up my hands and say, listen, absent further considerations, I have no clue whether such a thing is metaphysically possible, and the appearance of its possibility or its impossibility or whatever, those go away with, like, further specifications of what exactly we're talking about. So anyway, I think premise one is potentially very problematic. And by my lights, premise two is actually also questionable and indeed implausible by my lights. We're in the context of highfalutin, highly theoretic claims, highly theoretic matters extremely far removed from ordinary experience in a domain that intersects basically every single area of human inquiry. God's existence, that touches, as this video points out through all of its arguments, it touches epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, logic, sociology, linguistics, anthropology, economics even. Like, it touches all these different domains. So it's firstly a highly theoretic matter. Secondly, it intersects basically every single area of human inquiry. And so why then should we think that impossible things in this domain, in the domain of philosophy of religion, and in particular God's existence, why should we think that they would probably appear impossible to us on reflection? Think about how many impossible things are such that it is extremely difficult to discover their impossibility. And even when we do discover their impossibility, it still doesn't really seem or appear to us as a kind of phenomenological appearing. They don't appear or seem to us as impossible apart from going through those kind of long, complicated derivations. So, for instance, in one of my classes, we did certain proofs of the soundness and completeness of first-order propositional logic. Now, it's necessarily the case that first-order propositional logic is sound and complete, so it's impossible for it not to be sound and complete. But I don't have any appearings on that whatsoever, and the only reason why I accept it is because of these, like, super complicated derivations and arguments that we had to go through. So this is a case where the domain is highly theoretic and abstract. Now, in such contexts, it doesn't seem to be the case that, let's say, the unsoundness and incompleteness would even appear to me as impossible if they were impossible. Which they, in fact, are, of course. But why think that the case of God would be any different to this case? Both are highly theoretic domains, highly abstract domains. They intersect with lots of really complicated areas of human inquiry and so on. Why then should we think that if God's existence were impossible, it would probably appear to you that it's impossible upon further reflection? Think also about the falsity of Gödel's incompleteness theorems, or the truth or falsity of Goldbach's conjecture, or, again, Russellian set paradoxes. Like Frege and Cantor and Peano and so on, they didn't see the contradiction in the relevant systems, even when they reflected on the relevant systems and so on. Think about whether P equals NP in the context of mathematics, and so on. Like, there are so many different cases where things that are impossible wouldn't appear to us to be impossible upon reflection, despite the fact that they are impossible. It seems as though God would be more like these cases than others, given the highly abstract nature of this, given how it intersects with so many different domains of human inquiry, and so on. I mean, the most brilliant minds on Earth haven't figured out the impossibility of boatloads of things like this, even on extremely protracted and intense reflection. And so what I say is, why think God is any different? If anything, it seems that God would be even more difficult to be discovered as impossible, even if he were impossible, given, again, that it intersects so many different domains of inquiry and is intertwined with the entirety of one's worldview. I've given some reasons for being really hesitant about premise 1. I've given reasons to think that premise 2 is implausible. And also, we can think of a kind of symmetry argument here. I could equally well run the following argument. Hey, it appears to me that God possibly doesn't exist. It's reasonable for me to believe that if it's impossible that God doesn't exist, it would probably appear to me that it's impossible that God doesn't exist upon reflection. So, I'm prima facie justified in believing that God possibly doesn't exist. And of course, that supports the reverse modal ontological argument. Again, you might try to say, oh no, like it's not reasonable for you to believe that if it's impossible that God doesn't exist, it would probably appear to you to be impossible that God doesn't exist upon further reflection, because this is such a complex domain and so on. Like, yeah, okay, once you say that, that's precisely what I'm going to be saying in response to this second premise here. I do think symmetry is going to re-arise in this context. So that's the first point with respect to symmetry. But secondly, we don't even have to focus on God's possibly not existing. It appears to me that gratuitous evils are possible. Or I could say that it appears to me that it's possible for there to be a world in which there are boatloads of conscious beings that just suffer horrendously, and there are no goods accruing therefrom, from their extreme suffering. Given Chad's definition that he said earlier, where it's like appearing to you that it's possible, he said something like, oh, it doesn't seem to be contradictory, it doesn't seem to be impossible. It doesn't seem to be the case that this sort of suffering-filled world is impossible. And so it appears to me that this would be possible, and then I go on to say, oh, it's reasonable for me to believe that if gratuitous evils are impossible, then it would probably appear to me that they're impossible upon further reflection. So I'm prima facie justified in believing that gratuitous evils and this kind of horrendous world are possible. And yet, in such a world, God doesn't exist, because no perfectly loving God would allow such a world where there are horrendous evils that don't have any goods accruing therefrom. And so I'm prima facie justified in believing God possibly doesn't exist, which of course supports the reverse modal ontological argument. And the final point, let's say we even granted this third thing, you are prima facie justified in believing God possibly exists. Well, firstly, that's completely conditional on you having this seeming or appearing in the first premise. Lots of people don't seem to have it. And secondly, it's only a prima facie justification, so this is just lending some sort of super defeasible support to it. It could easily be overturned by boatloads of considerations. All you would need is some sufficiently weighty consideration against God's existence, perhaps even a prima facie consideration, which serves as a defeater for this prima facie justification. But anyway, I'm just talking about my vantage point on the epistemic landscape so that I can hopefully serve you and help you guys think critically about these sorts of questions. So, let us continue.
That is super interesting.
That's my own defense, yeah. Premise, and we have Gödel.
Quicker.
Yeah, so now let's move on to demonstrations of the possibility premise.
Demonstrations? No. You just have various axioms that no atheist would ever grant. But okay, let's set that aside. Firstly, I'm a little bit sad, and, you know, I can't really blame them, but I'm a little bit sad that the umlaut is not there, the Gödel. By the way, my mother's maiden name is like Gödel. It's spelled differently, but that spelling might have actually changed when a bunch of German immigrants came to the United States. Oftentimes, they change their names to make them kind of like Americanized. So, for instance, my mom's maiden name has a OE, which is the Americanized version of the O umlaut. So, who knows? Maybe I'm related to Gödel. No, I don't know. It's at least epistemically possible. It appears to me possible. Therefore, there's a possible world. Oh my goodness, never mind.
So it depends on some definitions and some axioms, and he derives from the definitions and axioms 3 theorems, T1, T2, T3. And rather than go through all of those, let me just say that T1, T2, and T3 do follow from the definitions and axioms. No one disputes this. This has been demonstrated many times over, even by computers, okay? So T1, T2, T3 follow from the definitions and A1 through A5. The question is whether the axioms are true. Yeah,
because the definitions are just like, you can just make any kind of definition that you want.
Right, and so the drama really concerns the first two axioms. What is a positive property? That's the question. And is it a property that's better to have than not? Is it a property that doesn't detract from excellence, but its opposite does? So there's some debate here about that. Well, Alexander Pruss, of course, he has a simplified version of...
So I do want to comment on this specifically. So firstly, this A2 says that positive properties entail only positive properties. Now, again, as Chad said, there are lots of difficulties here with trying to pin down what exactly a positive property is. But it's something like a perfection, it's something like a great-making feature, a feature that makes its possessor greater. Maybe it necessarily makes its possessor greater than it otherwise would have been had it lacked the feature, or something like that. But there are potential counterexamples to this, that positive properties entail only positive properties. So, for example, consider various love-manifesting virtues. These seem to be positive, They seem to be great-making features, and yet lots of them actually entail boatloads of negative properties. Consider, for instance, courage. Courage is a virtue, but it strictly entails there being at least some sort of actual or purported threat to one. So one can in some sense be threatened in some way, and that is not a positive property, being susceptible to being threatened in some kind of way. But anyway, my point is just that there are at least some reasons for caution with respect to A2, that positive properties entail only positive properties. But really, I think that there are certain fundamental problems with Gödelian ontological arguments, and really, I think it's probably going to go down to A3, that the atheist is just going to reject it. Consider that the relevant notion of entailment here is that one property entails another property, just in case. Necessarily, if X has the first property, then X also has the second property. With that in mind, intuitively, the property of being godlike is not going to be positive by the atheist's lights, because with that understanding of entailment at play, right, necessarily, if anything is godlike, then, trivially, it follows that it has literally every single property whatsoever, because the atheist thinks that being godlike is an impossible property. Nothing can instantiate that property. And so it is trivially true that, necessarily, everything that has the property of being godlike also has the property of being P, for any property P, right? This is a conditional with a necessarily false antecedent. And so what that means is that the conditional as a whole is necessarily true no matter what you plug in for the consequent property. And so what that means is that being godlike entails being super duper vicious and super duper horrendous, and also wanting to torture people as much as you can, wanting to maximize torture. It entails all of these sorts of things. And so in that case, no, that's not a positive property. And moreover, if we keep in mind A2, and if we accept, yeah, fine, it's a condition on positive properties that they entail only positive properties, well then of course no atheist is going to accept this. We already know, given modal ontological argument considerations, that the atheist doesn't grant that being godlike is possible. They actually think it's impossible. But in that case, it's going to entail literally every single other property, including negative properties. And so, no, given A2, it's not going to be a positive property. So no atheist, I think, should be willing to grant A3, and they're perfectly well within their epistemic rights in rejecting it, as I pointed out. Again, whether or not you think this argument succeeds is going to be entirely a function of whether or not you are already a theist. To go to my 4 ontological arguments in 12 minutes, because I explain the basics of Gödel's ontological argument and the basic thrust of my objection, which I've sort of been articulating here.
So the basic idea here, and I'm simplifying a bit for ease of exposition, is as follows. So note, this is an important note, a property P entails another property Q, just in case, necessarily, there is nothing that exemplifies P, but fails to exemplify Q. Okay, so here's the argument. 1, perfections don't entail imperfections. 2, the property being a necessarily existing perfect being is a perfection. 3, so the property being a necessarily existing perfect being is possibly exemplified. That follows from 1 and 2. Well, why does it follow from 1 and 2, you might ask? Well, suppose the property being a necessarily existing perfect being is not possibly exemplified. That is, suppose that the conclusion there is false. Well, that implies that the property in question entails everything. Every property, including any imperfection, right? Which contradicts premise 1, that perfections don't entail imperfections. So if premise 1 is true, you can actually get that in conjunction with premise 2, that premise 3 is true. Now, why does the impossible exemplification of being a necessarily existing perfect being, why does that entail every property? Well, because if P, for some property P, if that's not possibly exemplified, that is, if it is necessarily the case that P is not exemplified, well then obviously it is necessarily the case that there is nothing that exemplifies P, but that also fails to exemplify Q, for any Q, any arbitrary Q you want. If there cannot be anything that exemplifies P, well then obviously, there cannot be anything that both exemplifies P, but also is such that it fails to exemplify Q for any Q. Precisely because there cannot be anything that exemplifies P simpliciter as such. And that applies to any property Q whatsoever, including imperfections. And so, if the property being a necessarily existing perfect being were impossible, well then it would entail everything, including imperfections. But by premise 2, the property being a necessarily existing perfect being is a perfection. And remember, by premise 1, perfections don't entail imperfections. So, you can actually infer that the property being a necessarily existing perfect being is possibly exemplified. But here's premise 4, so it's possible that there is a necessarily existent perfect being, right? To say that the property being a necessarily existing perfect being is possibly exemplified is just to say that there's some possible world in which something exemplifies that. And the only thing that exemplifies that is obviously a necessarily existing perfect being. So, it's possible there's some possible world in which there's a necessarily existing perfect being, in which case it follows by S5 that there's a necessarily existing perfect being. I don't find this argument convincing. I don't. Premise 1 is supposed to be either a definitional truth or else undergirded by the intuition that if something is truly a perfection, well then there shouldn't be some tag-along property that is imperfect or something like that. You know, that would just seem to compromise the initial property status as a perfection if it is accompanied by some kind of imperfection, if it thereby makes something imperfect in addition to making it perfect somehow. So suppose that we grant premise 1. I'm fine with granting premise 1 that perfections only entail perfections.
I do have some hesitations for the same reasons that I just articulated. In particular, when I consider love manifesting virtues, they seem in some sense to be positive, and yet they seem to entail various properties that are not themselves positive. Someone might try to say, okay, well, no, the property of being courageous is not itself positive. Maybe that's a complex property and it's composed of various more fundamental properties, and maybe you can disentangle those such that some of them are positive and others are negative, and that can really account for the intuition that courage is positive. So someone might try to evade that point there. But anyway, my point is just that there are some points of hesitancy here for me with respect to that premise that positive properties only entail other positive properties.
That would just seem to compromise the initial property status as a perfection, if it is accompanied by some kind of imperfection, if it thereby makes something imperfect in addition to making it perfect somehow. So suppose that we grant premise 1. I'm fine with granting premise 1 that perfections only entail perfections, or at least perfections don't entail imperfections. I mean, a lot of people just say that that's definitionally true. Like, they just mean by perfection that it doesn't entail an imperfection. So it's a condition on being a perfection, that it doesn't entail an imperfection. But, I say, upon granting this, we can see that no atheist should be convinced by premise 2 at all. For an atheist already thinks that the existence of a necessarily existing perfect being is impossible, right? Remember the modal ontological argument. If the atheist granted the possibility of a necessarily existing perfect being, then they'd thereby be committed to its actuality. So, and thus, no one who isn't already convinced that atheism is false should grant premise 2. And thus, no one who doesn't already accept the conclusion should grant premise 2. In short, the argument should not convince any atheist, since by atheist's lights, the property being a necessarily existing perfect being is impossible, and hence entails everything, including imperfections. Given that perfections cannot entail imperfections, it obviously follows that being a necessarily existing perfect being is not a perfection. Contra premise 2. Okay, so that's my rundown of the basics of ontological arguments.
So basically, you would already antecedently have to be a theist in order to be in a position to justifiably accept that the property of being godlike, or the property of being a necessarily existent perfect being, or whatever, is positive. So for purposes of space and time, I'm actually not going to go through Graham Oppy's portion of his chapter here on the Gödelian ontological argument, although I highly recommend you guys check it out. It's not very long. It spans from, look, the bottom of page 58 through 59 through 60, and then the very, very top of page 61. So anyway, I recommend checking that out, and we can skip it because Oppy makes basically the exact same criticism that I just made in the video that I just played. It's basically the exact same criticism.
Gödel's argument, which just depends on 3 axioms. If you want to move on to this next slide. So there you have some resources on Gödel's argument. So Pruss's improvement just depends on those 3 axioms.
We have the exact same worries afflicting A2 here. One might think that intuitively there are some positive properties that entail other properties that are not themselves positive. But in any case, the point for present purposes is that once you recognize this sort of entailment claim here, once we already grant this, then no one who doesn't already accept that something necessarily exists would ever grant that necessary existence is positive. Because if they don't accept that necessary existence is even possible, if they think that it's impossible, well then clearly necessary existence is going to entail literally every property, as we've seen. This is just the principle of explosion. And in that case, necessary existence wouldn't, and indeed couldn't be positive, because it would entail everything, and so it would entail properties that are not themselves positive. And so necessary existence wouldn't be positive. So what this means is that you're really only in a position to justifiably accept A3 if you already antecedently accept that something necessarily exists. These arguments do nothing to move the dialectic. They don't give people any reason to accept their conclusions. Whether or not you accept one of the axioms that goes into them is entirely a function of whether or not you antecedently accept their conclusions. So,
which jointly entail the theorem, there is a necessarily existing being that essentially has P, which is all positive properties. So there you go. So Gödel's main insight is that, oh, we can prove that God possibly exists by this idea that he has all positive perfections. Maydole follows suit with his own argument to the...
Of course, you can prove anything as long as you have the desired axioms. And of course, as I've argued here, we've been given no reason to accept what has been proved precisely because whether or not one accepts one of the axioms is entirely a function of whether one is already antecedently committed to the very conclusion in question.
And this is his celebrated modal perfection argument, which is in the Blackwell Companion. He has 2 definitions here. Property is a perfection only if it is necessarily better to have than not. Something has a property of being supreme if and only if it's impossible for something to be greater and impossible for there to be something else than which is not greater. Okay, so from these 2 definitions, he has this argument: a property is a perfection only if its negation is not. Perfections entail only perfections. The property of being supreme is a perfection. So it's possible that a supreme being exists, and he derives 4 in Gödelian fashion from 1 through 3. Yes,
which is why this suffers the exact same problem that we've been facing. No one who doesn't already grant the existence of a supreme being would ever grant that a supreme being is a perfection, if we hold, of course, that it's a condition on being perfections, that they entail only perfections. Why is that? Well, because anyone who doesn't think that there is a supreme being, given modal ontological argument considerations, thinks that there cannot be such a thing. And if there cannot be such a thing, well then trivially, the property of being supreme entails absolutely everything, including imperfections, and so it wouldn't be a perfection, per premise 2. So again, this does nothing to make any headway in the dispute between theists and atheists. And moreover, it gives agnostics absolutely no reason to accept the conclusion.
1 through 3 jointly entail 4. 5, if it is possible that a supreme being exists, a supreme being exists. 6, so a supreme being exists. What's noteworthy about Maydole's argument is that it doesn't depend on S5 or B, like the other arguments do. He instead appeals to what's called the Barkin formula in modal logic, which is that if possibly something has F, then there is something that is possibly F.
See, that seems to me just absurd. So consider the property of essentially being a unicorn. I think it's somewhat plausible that unicorns are possible. They're metaphysically possible. Evolution presumably could have gone such a way that there are equine-like beings, so like horse-like beings, that have a single horn. Okay, that's all I'm going to define as a unicorn. So it's possible that there is something with the property of essentially being a unicorn. Does it follow that there actually is something which is such that that thing is possibly essentially a unicorn? No. No, it doesn't. Right, so I take it that firstly there are no things which are such that they are essentially unicorns, because there are no unicorns. Secondly, suppose that there is something that could possibly be essentially a unicorn. Well, then it's actually existent, but it's not a unicorn. But then it's not essentially a unicorn, right? And it couldn't essentially be a unicorn. Because to be essentially a unicorn is to be such that you cannot exist without being a unicorn. And so, given that nothing that actually exists is in fact a unicorn, it simply follows that nothing that exists could be essentially a unicorn. Because then it would accidentally be a non-unicorn, and hence its being a unicorn would likewise be accidental. It wouldn't even be essential to it. So that's a little bit of a complicated chain of reasoning, but if you think through it, you can see that this Barkin formula is just absurd. Moreover, the Barkin formula, if true, would be necessarily true. It's one of these fundamental principles of modal logic, but it's just obviously incompatible with traditional theism. Traditional theism says God could have refrained from creating, for instance, so go to that world in which God doesn't create anything apart from himself. That world is just God there existing alone. But it's still true in that world that it's possible that something is a human, or it's possible that something is a dog from that world, right? God could still create those things. But it doesn't follow that in that world there actually exists something which is possibly a dog. Because suppose that did follow. Well, in that world, the only thing that exists is God. And so it would follow that God is possibly a dog. Okay, that's absurd. No, God is not possibly a dog. No, that's just ludicrous. Again, that goes against traditional theism. So, if you want to accept the Barkin formula, okay. I mean, firstly, it's false. But secondly, if you want to accept it, fine. But just, you're going to have to get rid of traditional theism.
That's the Barkin formula in kind of a rough way. So he derives 5 using the Barkin formula. And so he concludes that a supreme being exists. And if you want to go to the next slide, I'll just show.
So, one thing that's interesting. We might think that knowledge of some fact is a perfection. So, knowledge of some fact is a perfection. I'm going to say a property is a perfection only if its negation is not. I'm going to say perfections only entail perfections. Moreover, I'm going to say the property of knowing that God doesn't exist is a perfection. Why is that? Well, again, this is knowledge. Think about it intuitively, right? Intuitively, if you know something, right? I'm not saying that someone does in fact know that God doesn't exist, and I'm not even saying that God doesn't exist. I'm just saying the property of knowing that God doesn't exist is a perfection, because after all, this is knowledge. That's a great making feature, to have knowledge, right? So the property of knowing that God doesn't exist is a perfection. And so you can conclude from the fact that perfections entail only perfections, and the property of knowing God doesn't exist is a perfection, you can conclude that it's possible that there's a state of affairs in which someone knows that God doesn't exist. But of course, knowledge is factive, it entails truth. So it follows that there's a possible state of affairs, is there a possible world in which God doesn't in fact exist. And of course, if God possibly doesn't exist, we've been learning throughout this that if possibly God doesn't exist, then of course God doesn't exist. And so we have a Gödelian ontological argument for atheism. Now, of course, how are you going to respond to this as a theist? Maybe you're going to reject that the property of knowing that God doesn't exist is a perfection. And why is that? Well, because you're going to go through the exact same reasoning that I just went through earlier. You're going to say, well, no, to say that that's a perfection, given this second premise here, that perfections entail only perfections, to say that the property of knowing that God doesn't exist is a perfection, is to basically antecedently grant that the property of knowing that God doesn't exist is possible. But of course, no theist would ever grant that that is possible, because to grant that that is possible is to grant that God is possibly non-existent, which in turn is to grant that God doesn't exist. So no one who doesn't already antecedently accept atheism would ever accept my premise there. So yes, that's the response that the theist should, and I think would, probably give. But then, of course, that's literally the exact same response that the atheist is giving here with respect to premise 3. That's the exact same response I've been developing here. You can see that I think that this argument is just so implausible. Gödelian ontological arguments more generally, they all seem to suffer from this fundamental problem. And we also have this parity argument, and the way that the theists try to get around that, it seems, the only plausible way for them to get around that is to say, no, that property is not a perfection, or at least we've been given no non-question begging reason to think that is a perfection, precisely because to say that it is a perfection is to assume that it's possible. But of course, no theist would ever grant that property, that knowing that God doesn't exist, no theist would ever grant that that's even possible in the first place. But similarly, no atheist would ever grant that the property of being godlike, or the property of being a perfect being, or the property of being a supreme being, no atheist would ever grant that that's possible in the first place, and hence no atheist would ever grant that the property of being supreme is a perfection. It's the same response.
Show you his derivation. That's how he does it. So premise 2 there is the Barkin formula. Bernstein's argument, which again is a demonstration of the possibility premise, or an attempted one, he defines a perfection as a property that in no way detracts from a being's greatness. But its complement does, its opposite does. So he has this argument. Suppose for reductio, it's impossible that something has all perfections. If it's impossible that something has all perfections, then there is a perfection that is sufficient for not having some other perfection, namely the one with which it is inconsistent. If a property is sufficient for not having some perfection, then that property is sufficient for being imperfect. If a property is sufficient for being imperfect, then it is not a perfection. So there is some perfection that is sufficient for not having some perfection, follows from 1 and 2. So there is some perfection that is sufficient for being imperfect, 3 and 5. And then we have a contradiction here. There is some perfection that is not a perfection. And so that means our starting assumption must have been false. And so we can conclude, possibly, something has all perfections.
Right, so this argument suffers from essentially the same problem that all the other ones do, because this is a still further version of the Gödelian-type ontological arguments. So let's look at premise 4. We could just take this as conditional or definitional of what a perfection is. So if a property is sufficient for being imperfect, then it's not a perfection. This is equivalent to saying that if a property is a perfection, then it doesn't entail imperfections. But once again, now this is the exact same thing that we've been seeing. It's basically saying, well, perfections don't entail imperfections, or perfections don't entail being imperfect. But once you grant that, no atheist would grant that any uniquely divine property is, in fact, a perfection, because we already know, per modal ontological argument considerations, that the atheist doesn't grant that such properties are even possibly exemplified. The atheist doesn't grant that the property of being God is perfect, or that the atheist doesn't grant that the property of being God is possible, or that the property of being omniscient is possible, or that the property of being omnipotent is possible, or that whatever. We already know that. And so we know, then, in conjunction with 4, that none of these things are perfections, because again, a condition on being a perfection is that it doesn't entail imperfections, and yet the atheist thinks that all these various things are impossible, and hence they entail literally everything, including imperfections. And so the argument is dialectically toothless. We're not going to be able to get that any uniquely divine property is a perfection under this. And so again, granting premise 4, this conclusion is going to be basically have nothing to do with God, and whether or not you think it has something to do with God is already just going to be a function of whether you are antecedently committed to theism or not. The non-theist, granting 4, right, to say possibly something has all perfections, well, you already don't think that omniscience is among the perfections, you don't think that omnipotence is among the perfections, and so on. So to say that possibly something has all perfections, then, for the atheist is just going to be something like, yeah, it's possible that there's something which has the best collection of compossible great-making properties that there is to be had under an atheistic worldview. And that's going to be nowhere near God. It's going to be, like, literally nothing close to God. And there's no guarantee that necessary existence is even going to be in there. Think of it this way. Given that atheists think that the property of being God, the property of being omniscient, and so on, given that they think that these things are impossible, they also think that they entail everything, including that they entail that their possessor is imperfect in various ways, and that it doesn't have all perfections. And so, this conclusion here, for the atheist, right, is going to be nowhere near God. Because the conclusion here, possibly something has all perfections, well, that clearly couldn't be God, because if it were God, again, by the atheist lights, whatever is God, that entails literally everything, because it's a necessarily uninstantiated property, and so it entails that the thing doesn't have all perfections. And so then this thing would have all perfections and not have all perfections, which is absurd. And so it can't be God, right? And so what this means is that whether or not you think that this conclusion gets you to God or anything near God is already going to be a function of your antecedent commitments to theism or atheism. These Gödelian-style arguments are basically working on a subtle trick. I'm not saying that it's an intentional manipulation or anything like that, or an intentional trick, but they are all just relying, again, on basically two claims. Firstly, this claim about property entailment, that a perfection does not entail imperfections, or a perfection only entails other perfections. And secondly, that something like the property of being God, or at least some property that is only unique, necessarily unique to God, is a perfection. Those two alone suffice to capture the basic thrust of pretty much all of these Gödelian ontological arguments. Once we admit that it is a condition on being a perfection, that it entails only other perfections, no atheist would ever grant that any divine property is a perfection, because no atheist would ever grant that any divine property is even possible in the first place. And it would be a condition, given one, it would be a condition on being a perfection that it is possible in the first place. All of this, in essence, still boils down to whether or not you think that God, or at least some uniquely divine property, is possible in the first place. And we've already seen that you're making no headway in the dispute by simply saying, oh, it is possible. And of course, no atheist would ever grant that God, or any uniquely divine property, is indeed possible in the first place.
There's one argument left for ontological, so let's get that one out of the way.
Let's wait. Okay. Yeah, and so here's the further resources for that one from Bernstein. All right,
Okay,
Nagasawa's. Then this one is the most recent, from what I understand.
Yeah, pretty much. And Nagasawa's main insight is this. It's that we shouldn't start with separate ideas of what it means to be omniscient, what it means to be omnipotent, or morally perfect, and so on, and then add all those concepts together to get God. He says instead, we should just define God as the being that has the maximum consistent set of knowledge, power, goodness, and so on. So whatever being has that maximally consistent set, that is God. So he defines two properties: real maximal excellence, which is having a maximal consistent set of knowledge, power, and goodness, and real maximal greatness, which is real maximal excellence in every possible world. And he has this argument. It runs exactly like Plantinga's argument, except that we avoid the problem of whether or not the concept of God is logically consistent, because that's just built into the argument now. There's a possible world in which real maximal great being exists. That's just now.
So no, this is something that's actually always quite triggered me about Nagasawa's argument. There are several problems with the argument itself, but firstly, Nagasawa defines this being as a being which has the maximal consistent collection of great-making features. But consistency isn't sufficient for possibility. It's logically consistent to say that water is H3O. There's nothing in the abstract logical form or structure of that sentence, which is either of the form P and not P, or entails a statement of the form P and not P. But it's a further question as to whether or not it's metaphysically possible. So it doesn't matter at all whether or not you're defining this being as having the maximal consistent set of great-making features. What matters is whether or not it has the maximal compossible collection of great-making features. So all you really need to do is modify wherever he just said consistent and insert compossible. But that's just one thing that has always extremely bothered me about this maximal God approach sort of thing. This premise here actually doesn't follow if you're defining a maximally great being as one with maximal consistent set, because the mere fact that its great-making features are all consistent doesn't entail that there is a possible world, a metaphysically possible world, in which such a being exists. That would only be true if you defined it as a maximal compossible collection. In any case, though, I still think this is quite implausible. The reason is because why should we think that this maximal compossible collection of properties is anything better than like a super virtuous embodied sentient organism or something like that? In fact, unless one antecedently assumes that naturalism is false, one can't rule that out. So yet again, the argument isn't going to be at all convincing to naturalists. One would only be inclined to accept that the being at which it arrives is a divine-like being if one is antecedently a theist. Moreover, premise 2 there is also deeply questionable. Why think necessary existence is found in a collection that is overall better than absolutely every single other collection of properties there could be that include a mere contingent existence? Again, the naturalists will probably reject this, right? If there's a naturalistically acceptable necessary being, then it's going to be something like a universal wave function, or maybe a collection of particles, or maybe some quantum state, or something, maybe the initial state of the universe, or whatever. It's going to be something like that. But that's going to be nowhere near as great as someone like Gandhi, or Mother Teresa, or Josh Rasmussen, or etc., 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 Nelson Mandela, or whatever. Pick your favorite person. I'm going to put in Josh Rasmussen there. Josh Rasmussen is still much greater, much more valuable than this necessarily existent quantum field or whatever. And so, even if necessary existence is a great-making feature, why think that necessary existence is going to be found in the greatest compossible collection of great-making features? No, arguably there's going to be a better collection of great-making features, namely the ones that Josh Rasmussen exemplifies, that he instantiates. But a necessary existence isn't going to be among them. One cannot conclude from the possibility of a maximally compossible set of great-making features had by some being. You're not going to be able to get from its possibility to its actuality, because in order to do that, you need necessary existence, and yet, it's not at all clear that necessary existence would be included in the greatest maximally compossible set of great-making features. And it would seem as though only those who already antecedently reject something like naturalism would ever be inclined to accept that.
Here's a way to illustrate Nagasawa's point. When I was in middle school, I played, I'm a big wrestling fan, pro wrestling fan, and I played this, I forget which one was out then, I think it was just called like SmackDown or something, but the SmackDown game, you could create your own character, and you could make him super fast, you could make him super strong, you could make him super agile, and super tough. He couldn't really move around much, and he was just player mode, and then you would decrease strength in tandem with increasing agility, speed, and so forth until you reach some maximum of each of the individual characteristics for an ideal character. So that's basically what Nagasawa is doing here. He's saying, rather than maximize each individual attribute, let's just bring them all down to wherever they're at, wherever they need to be to all be sort of mutually consistent.
Seems to me like the question then would be like, would that being, whatever that being is, would that being exist necessarily?
That is definitely one question, which is the second criticism that I just raised.
Exist necessarily? Yeah, maybe my question would be, well,
yeah, so Chad almost glossed over that, but that was a really good point from Cameron. Again, it's crucial that you have necessary existence within this collection, but the naturalist, again, is probably going to think that, no, the greatest compossible collection of great-making features is not going to include necessary existence. It's going to be something like Josh Rasmussen or maybe some other sentient being which is like super-duper good, but not necessarily existent.
What if the maximally consistent set of attributes is just really unimpressive?
Yeah, this is also a good point, right? Why think it's anything like God rather than, I think he's going to point out like some like Zeus-like character or maybe even some like super virtuous embodied sentient organism, again, like Josh Rasmussen.
What if it's just like what if it amounts to like no more than like a Zeus type being?
Or what if it even, again, the naturalist thinks it's probably going to amount to nothing more than something like a really good embodied sentient organism or something like that.
Would we consider that God at that point? And I asked Eugen about this, actually, in preparation, and he said, well, it's on the atheist, it's on the critic to show that the maximally consistent set of attributes would be a very unimpressive, non-godlike being.
No, it's not. Nagasawa is the one here offering the positive argument for God's existence. The onus is on Nagasawa, who's offering the positive argument to give us some reason to think that this being would be godlike. After all, he's the one claiming to give an argument for God's existence. All I need to do is say, no, here are some other epistemic possibilities. Why think that you can rule those out? Give me some reason to rule those out. It'd be absurd for him to turn around and say, oh no, you need to give me some reason to rule those out. Like, what? No, you're the one offering a positive argument here. You're the one trying to justify God's existence. You're the one who needs to rule out these other possibilities, because if you don't, then your argument fails. Your argument fails as an argument for God's existence. It'd be equally compatible with there being these other just mundane great beings, like Josh Rasmussen or something. So anyway, no, this is a burden-shifting maneuver. It is an illicit burden-shifting maneuver. The onus is on Nagasawa to show that this thing would be like God. The onus is not on the detractor to show why it wouldn't be like God.